First question is it's from Mr. Michael Yusinko. He's asking at what age should Filipinos study and learn about free speech and press freedom?
I think that's a terrific question, and I think in trying to give a comprehensive answer to that, I think we will be forced to reconsider the kind of education that we actually have in the Philippines. I think you cannot be too young to study, to start to learn the civic virtue of freedom of expression and its related rights, free speech, free press, and so on. I realize that because we will be dealing with children, we might have to treat the questions in a different way. I mean, I certainly would not make this same presentation before a class of first grade students. We would have to meet them where they are. But let me just repeat, no one is too young to learn the civic virtue of freedom of expression.
Right. Thank you for that, sir. Actually, sir, is there well, you teach, but I would assume that you teach in college already, not the not the lower not basic education. But would you know as to whether or not in grade school or in high school there are attempts to try to include this in the curriculum? To my recollection, I'm not so sure that there's any attempt to do that.
I am not current with the state of basic education. From experience, and this goes back a long way back, I mean, we had courses in social studies, for instance, where we in fact discussed the Philippine Constitution. I remember when I was in high school, we even talked about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea because it was being negotiated at the time. That's how old I am. And we had discussions in the classroom. I would think that there are modules right now in basic education that raise this and related issues. I cannot speak with any precision. If there is a need for us, anyone else who is interested to work with our teachers and administrators to 12 to produce modules on freedom of expression, free speech, free press, I think that would be great. I know that there is currently under the law the MIL literacy, which is usually a course taught in grade 11, although there are some exceptions. Sometimes it's in 10, sometimes grade 12. Unfortunately, I think that the potential that MIL poses has not been actualized. I think it ends up being really more about computer technology rather than teaching, for instance, our grade 11 kids exactly what the news cycle is, how the news is put together, and in that way fostering a greater understanding of the freedom of the press. Sorry, Attorney Carrie, audio.
Yeah, there's a comment here from Sir Lambert Ramirez. So Sir Lambert is here. Hi, Sir Lambert. He's saying that an organization, Libertas, was able to make exemplars or modules which integrate the salient features of rule of law in a very simple manner. So apparently that is something that is quite doable, and hopefully there will be groups who who would be more than willing to help out in this type of endeavor.
I
Anyway,
think,
sir, we'll go on to the next. Yes, sir.
hold on. I think it's a
Yes, po.
wonderful initiative, but I also want to caution my fellow citizens, our participants today, uh, not to be put off by the emphasis I placed on legal language. There are other ways for us to deepen our appreciation of freedom of expression. So, for instance, I'm not a psychologist, but certainly you can put together a module on freedom of expression, for instance, as meeting Abraham Maslow's highest level in the hierarchy of needs, no? Or self-actualization. So there would be there are different ways, there are different languages where we treat freedom of expression. Fortunately or unfortunately, and this is my sense, in the Philippines, much of our language related to freedom of expression is legalistic, is based on our basic laws. But I can, I can easily imagine sociologists, psychologists, linguists coming together with a different take, but all promoting the understanding and exercise of freedom of expression.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we have like 3 more questions. I think we can, yeah, I think we can fit them in. First one is from Frances Garganera. So her question goes, in the premise of government intervention, is the intervention important to the freedom of expression, speech and freedom of the press? And to what extent is this intervention encouraged and limited?
Again, I don't want to commit the fallacy of misplaced emphasis. In my prepared remarks, I did not write anything about limitations on freedom of expression. But like any other right, there are limits that we must place on it. Who places those limits? It could be the state. It could be society through, for instance, tradition or some sort of historical consensus. Or it could be just one person with an outsized influence on an entire group. There are many ways in which even a fundamental right like freedom of expression can be limited or should be limited. Back to the legal language that we normally use, when we speak of rights like freedom of expression, which is part of the Bill of Rights, we are under that constitutional tradition, we are actually talking about a relationship between the citizen and the state. And the Bill of Rights guarantees us, the citizens, protection against undue intervention by the state. So the Bill of Rights actually governs the relationship between citizen and state. There are traditional limits on free speech, right? You cannot just stand up in the middle of a crowded theater, movie theater. Of course, that image now is so, I mean, who has been to a theater in the last 6 months, right? But nobody can stand up in a movie theater and falsely shout fire, causing panic. That's not protected. That's not allowed by our freedom of expression. We cannot divulge, for instance, troop movements. That's a natural consequence of the need for government to keep certain national security related secrets confidential. So there are established limits. I think Francis's assumption, if I may put it this way, actually is what happens when we deal with non-traditional interventions, right? What happens, for instance, when a platform like Facebook is more powerful than the Philippine state, right? does the Bill of Rights cover the relationship between Facebook friend and Facebook? That's something that has to be worked out. I certainly don't have the answer. Um, there must be a community consensus. Perhaps the state can also come in as it has for instance, in Europe. So there are stricter regulations on the use of Facebook, for instance, and states have actually penalized Facebook for flouting these regulations. So I think the potential interventions that I think is behind Francis's question. I think those are the exciting things. I mean, it's an exciting field to work on. I mean, people like you, Attorney Carey, I think you would be one of those who would have to think these things through.
Thank you, sir. Actually, sir, I was going to do a follow-up, but maybe I'll just comment on, I'll just leave a question hanging there, because we did talk about social media platforms and how government should most likely regulate them. But what about in cases where social media platforms are actually maximized by the state or by the government for certain purposes? So, and yeah, I'm not sure that we can answer that question at this point. But anyway, sir, we will move on to the next question. There is a question here about whether the Philippine Constitution differentiates between freedom of expression and freedom of speech.
So the answer I would think is, I'm not a lawyer. Or I did go to law school, but I did finish. I just went there to make friends with lawyers. The provision in the Constitution, Article 3, Section 4, is very clear. There is a distinction between free speech and freedom of expression. I think that maybe the better way to look at it is that freedom of expression is the mother right, which includes other types of expression, not just the usual, through print or by talking and so on. So, of course, in the US, that entire legal tradition falls under free speech. But I think that because of the way our 1987 Constitution is phrased, we can actually seize that as an opportunity to widen the coverage of freedom of expression. Freedom of expression would include many things that right now we cannot even imagine, but maybe in the future some kid will put into practice. I don't know if I'm making sense, but yes, there is a distinction that our Constitution makes. I would like to suggest that that distinction allows us the opportunity to widen even more the coverage of freedom of expression.
All right, sir. There's also this question in relation to how the Spanish colonization differs. I think it's in the context of freedom of expression and freedom of the press and speech. How does the Spanish colonization differ from the American colonization, and how did it affect the Filipino culture, or how Filipinos view freedom of expression and freedom of the press?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. A question I did not expect to be asked. I think it's very interesting that even though in the late 19th century or in the mid 19th century, there was an attempt by the then liberal Spanish government in Madrid to encourage their subjects in the Philippines to speak Spanish, that policy was not in fact implemented. So you have the example of Jose Rizal in February, was it 1888, writing a letter to the women of Malolos. Why did he write his longest letter in Tagalog to the women of Malolos? Because the women of Malolos got into trouble because they wanted to learn Spanish. It was in the statute books, and yet it was not implemented. So they wanted to know, they wanted to, Marcelo H. Del Pilar asked Rizal to write his province mates a word of encouragement. That's the background to this historic letter to the women of Malolos. What does that tell us? I think that in terms of pursuing their colonial objectives, the fact that the Americans actively encourage the use of English, which is why we're speaking in this language now, explains why I'm going to put this in quotes, they were a more successful colonizer than the Spanish. Was it Nick Joaquin who said we spent 300 years in a Spanish convent and 50 years in Hollywood? The 50 years in Hollywood have been formative for the Philippine nation. We are much more Americanized than we are Hispanized. And I think that's partly because as a colonial experiment, the Americans were more successful in the Philippines, and partly because they encourage the use of the language. I'm sure that has an impact on free speech, free press, freedom of expression. The fact that let me go on a little detour. Before Rizal wrote the Noli, he tried to master the French language. So he wrote the Noli, I think, between 1884 and 1887. He tried to master the French language. Why? Because French was the language of the elite in the 19th century. It's the same thing in War and Peace. The Russian elite also wanted to learn and in fact spoke in French. When Rizal realized that he was not that good in French, not good enough to write an entire novel, he shifted to Spanish. I think that tells us that there is something to be said about mastering the language of the powers that be. So yes, Rizal earned his stature among his fellow Filipinos because he was a master of the Spanish language. If he had also been a master of the French language, I think that we would have seen his global reputation rise even further. That's in the same way we have many people writing masterfully in English, and now we are. What was it that the poet Derek Walcott reminded us? We are now. He said something about the English language is thriving at its periphery, not at the center. And he was talking about the experience of people like him, and I guess even I would include writers in the Philippines. Again, I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think the question of a comparison between Spanish and American colonial experiences, language must be a paramount consideration.
Right. Thank you, sir. Sir, I think we'll just close this portion with some comments from Ma'am Chit Asis as well as from Mr. Ira Cruz. Ira mentioned that the question regarding education was rather timely since we're practically putting kids in front of devices the entire day nowadays as we roll into distance learning. Mm-hmm. Also, Ma'am Chit is saying that well, she just wanted to comment on the question a while ago, the first one, and she wanted to say that freedom of expression must be viewed as a value that we teach our children at home. It is the home that set the conditions for children to eventually develop the confidence and capacity to discern freedom of speech. Thus, it must not be viewed as a political right, but as a basic value.
And I think that's a great comment, both Ira's and of the last one. I think that's a in fact, that's one of the things we can learn from rediscovering what the Katipuneros, the founding generation of the Katipunan, thought about freedom of expression. If you look at their principal documents, many of them are moral. They're all moral codes. And I think they're onto something. So if we can uh, rethink freedom of expression, not only as a political right or a legal right, but an ethical uh, consideration as a moral, as a virtue, I think that we can learn a lot from Bonifacio and especially Emilio Jacinto about how we can take the next step forward.